Je vais maintenant passer la parole à Ronald Berry, qui est doctorant en littérature américaine à l'Université de Paris et à terre à l'Université Gustave Eiffel. Ronald a publié déjà sur le concept d'intelligibilité raciale. Il s'intéresse aux stratégies politiques, économiques et identitaires développées par la blanchité américaine, qu'il condense sous le concept de White Innocence, dont il va nous parler ce matin, en résistance aux transformations politiques qui ont commencé sous le mouvement des droits civiques. Sa recherche s'intéresse plus précisément aux critiques littéraires du racialisme et à la relation symbiotique entre la race et le genre. Ce matin, Ronald va nous parler justement du concept de racial intelligibility and the pursuit of happiness in Baldwin's Another Country. Voilà, il a notamment publié dans la RFEA et nous allons l'écouter maintenant pour donc 20 minutes.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I hope you can hear me. Just to let you know that I'm having some issues, so excuse me if I have to use my my pump while I'm speaking. So today I will be presenting the article, James Baldwin, Civil Rights, Gender Performativity, and White Innocence. This research takes as its subject author James Baldwin's assessment on American whiteness. During the Civil Rights Movement, Baldwin, a native of Harlem, New York, was launched into the literary spotlight by his magnum opus, The Fire Next Time. Published in 1963, the book of essays confronts America's white liberal faction. Following scholar Rebecca Anur, Rebecca Arnold's lead, I define white liberalism as a social formation meant to designate those individual whites who want to distance themselves from racism, who want to be viewed as not racist. White liberal ideologies, however, ensconce inherent contradictions between whiteness and the conditionality of America's race relations. In The Fire Next Time, Baldwin posits that the social functionality of whiteness is prescriptive, acting as a predominating model of human potential, a hegemon placing itself at the highest echelon of a race-based hierarchy, covertly conveying the latent belief that whiteness, invisible and universal, is a paragon of social and democratic virtue which should be adopted by non-white groups. Baldwin observes that, and I quote, "White Americans find it difficult as white people elsewhere to divest themselves of the notion that they are in possession of some intrinsic value that Black people need or want. And this assumption, which, for example, makes the solution to the Negro problem depend on the speed with which Negroes accept and adopt white standards, it is the Negro, of course, who is presumed to have become equal, an achievement that not only proves the confronting fact that perseverance has no color, but also overwhelmingly corroborates the white man's sense of his own value." Furthermore, white liberalism has the penchant to place an ideological line between what it concedes to be behavioral racism, ignoring structurally impregnated forms of racism inherent in whiteness as a belief system, and therefore demarcating racist attitudes as a personal or individualistic and not communal, or as personal and or individualistic and not communal. These poignant and oftentimes aphoristic observations led Baldwin to become a figurehead of the civil rights movement, however reluctant he was to accept such a claim. Nonetheless, Baldwin used his new platform to give a series of televised and newspaper interviews to discuss what was widely considered America's race problem. Yet I believe that Baldwin's defining moment was when on May 12, 1963, the writer sent the Attorney General Bobby Kennedy a telegram to criticize the administration's passive response to the human rights violations Martin Luther King and other Black protesters encountered during the Birmingham campaign to end racial segregation. Moved by Baldwin's words, Bobby Kennedy invited Baldwin and other activists to have breakfast on May 24th, 1963 at his home to discuss who are the Negroes other Negroes will listen to. In what follows, I take into account Baldwin's literary critiques on whiteness as tools of interpretation to comprehend the Baldwin-Kennedy meeting. On the main, I challenge that white innocence, an indispensable modality of whiteness, becomes an implicit actor in the eventual breakdown of the meeting and more broadly characterizes an obstacle to reaching the consciousness of white America in civil rights matters. To be clear, white innocence transcends modes of pubescent or prolapsarian conditionality. Rather, Baldwin appropriates the term to designate what he saw as a construct of white identity, which, and I quote, protects whites against reality or experience or change and succeeds in placing beyond the reach of corruption values whites prefer not to examine. It is my hope, end quotes, it is my hope that framing this research against the backdrop of the Baldwin-Kennedy meeting will foster further interest in Baldwin's conceptualization of white innocence and how it temporizes discussions on race. Now, although Baldwin had reservations about Robert Kennedy's investment in civil rights matters, the writer arrived at the meeting with stark enthusiasm, believing that JFK, and I quote, was the man for the job, end quote. During Kennedy's 1960 presidential campaign against Republican frontrunner Richard Nixon, for example, the senator, Kennedy, the then senator, endorsed himself as a warrior for civil rights. In a debate with Nixon, he promised to intervene in matters involving civil rights through legislative action, and even went as far as to convene with Martin Luther King in June 1960 to discuss civil rights matters, demonstrating his good faith. As acting president, JFK was rhetorically in favor of civil rights for Black Americans, yet did not pass any civil rights legislation the first 2 years of his presidential mandate. Garth E. Pauley offers us one possible reason for Kennedy's slow pace, suggesting that Kennedy, and I quote, did not comprehend the significance of race as the dominant factor in African Americans' troubled lives. Rather, race was often just another political issue, seeing civil rights as a peripheral issue and wanted to keep it that way, end quote. Baldwin understood the Kennedy's administration's track record on civil rights and was thus familiar with the political terrain ahead of him. It was for this reason he enlisted a cohort of Black artists, activists, and intellectuals such as Harry Belafonte, Lena Horne, Lorraine Hansberry, and Kenneth Clark to offer a diversity of perspectives. However, the Baldwin-Kennedy meeting quickly revealed diverging ideologies on how to achieve the aims of the movement. Bobby Kennedy urged that the federal government's political measures would suffice to stop state-sanctioned racial violence and discrimination in the South, producing as evidence a list of facts and statistics to prove that he and the Justice Department were doing everything in their power. Baldwin and Hansberry argued, however, the importance to recognize civil rights as a moral issue which should be fought in the hearts of the American people and which should be understood as crucial to preserving America's already fragile democratic process. Baldwin and his cohort continued to insist that civil rights were equally a question of the moral trajectory of the nation and its future as a beacon of freedom and democracy around the world, further emphasizing the necessity to declare the civil rights movement a moral issue. Hansberry elicited the performative nature of masculinity inherent in the relationship between white supremacy and anti-Black violence, invoking the recent brutal arrest by white police of a Black woman protesting in the South. Hansberry questions, in essence, the state of a civilization that produces white men who would stand on a Black woman's neck. In a later interview with the Village Voice, Hansberry echoed the sentiments of the activists present that Bobby Kennedy scarcely understood why Blacks felt the need to protest at all. Suffice it to say, Baldwin and other activists, David Liming notes, were not there to hear statistics. Their concern was to convey to Kennedy that time for compromise for nonviolence was running out. warning the Attorney General that more militant organizations were gaining popularity amongst the youth of America's Black communities. Baldwin understood, however, that if peaceful measures did not suffice to hedge anti-Black physical violence and legal discrimination, more extreme measures would be inevitable. Although Baldwin was not ready to abandon King's program of nonviolence, he recognized nonetheless that, and I quote, the useful function of a racist organization such as the Nation of Islam was to scare white people, end quote. Unfortunately, the meeting did not end well, with many of its attendees storming out. And the Voice Hansberry noted, when we left the Kennedy's apartment, I felt I had a feeling of complete futility. And as we got on the elevator, I wondered if there is any way to make the white people in this country understand. And The Fire Next Time, Baldwin writes, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, a fearful and delicate problem which compromises when it does not corrupt all the American efforts to build a better world here, there, anyway, end quote. Baldwin echoes the color line of which W.E.B. Du Bois spoke in The Souls of Black People, published in 1903, to identify the breakdown of communication that Hansberry recognized in Bobby Kennedy, an agent of the federal government. The corruptive potentiality of the color line is the threshold of personal experience which alienates the white conscious from empathetic responses to racial brutality. And Baldwinian terms, the writer conceptualizes the psychological estrangement as the innocence of whiteness. Bobby Kennedy's exasperation in the face of the Black activists' protestation characterizes what Nathaniel Mills calls white America's at best condescending and at worst racist interpretations of this, and I end quote, of the social roles Black and white play in American life. White innocence can therefore be characterized as lying somewhere in between condescendence and racism. In Another Country, published in 1962, Baldwin uses his literary imagination to expound on the psychological estrangement he witnessed in his meeting with Bobby Kennedy. Rather, Baldwin's relationship with white liberalism was formed by his own encounters with the artistic left in New York's West Village of the 1940s and 1950s. Fresh out of high school, Baldwin had attempted to flee his father's authoritarian hold, the poverty of Harlem, and the constraints of racial classification. Baldwin realized, however, that race and racism were national phenomena which would haunt him whether he was in New York writing, or New Jersey working in a factory, or in San Francisco where he debunked the city's stance of racial equality. No other character in Baldwin's writings expressed the liberal ideology that Baldwin witnessed in his lifetime than Vilvato Moore, an aspiring novelist. Baldwin's character personifies the liberal ideologies that Baldwin called an affliction, which he considered perpetuates America's race problem. Vilvato's friendship with Black jazz musician Rufus Scott, and the subsequent romantic relationship that blooms between Vilvato and Ida Scott, an aspiring jazz singer, and Rufus's sister, is jeopardized by Vilvato's inability to recognize the weight race plays in the lives of his friends. Furthermore, Vilvato vilifies Rufus and Ida for the contempt they harbor towards New York's West Village white cohort who frequent Harlem's night scene, but ignores the economic disparity in which the uptown Manhattan community lives. Explaining to Cass, another member of their group, the difficulties he and Ida are having in their relationship, Vivaldo attempts to efface the difference in experience the racial divide permeates on the New York City landscape. And I quote, "They're colored and I am white, but the same things happened, really the same things. And how can I make them know that?" "But they didn't," Cass says. happened to you because you were white. What happens up here in Harlem happens because they are colored, and that makes all the difference. Furthermore, the innocence with which Volvato approaches race renders him inapt to recognizing and thus dealing with the depression from which Rufus suffers from, brought on by racial insecurities and self-hatred because he believed, because, and I quote, he believes what people said about him, end quote. In the end, Rufus jumps off the George Washington Bridge, committing suicide in attempts, one could say, to alleviate his pain. Furthermore, Volvato ignores the explicit incoherencies in his penchant for Black women, his identity as white, and the reality of life in the Harlem, which serves as a microcosm for the US. Later on, Volvato refuses to accept responsibility or the hand he played in the death of his best friend. Volvato's friendship with Rufus and love affair with Ida, however, are the key to relinquishing his hiding place. Baldwin often employs seemingly unintelligible relationships, interracial, homosexual, bisexual, or even incestuous, to break the apparent intelligibility of white heteronormative relationships. Baldwin uses these levers, and I quote, to create the consciousness of the others, the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious Blacks, two levers who must not falter in their duty to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world, end quote. In another country, Volvato eventually ceases hiding from the love that Ida offers and begins to acknowledge his place in America's racial nightmare. Baldwin places the revelation not in a theatrical lover's brawl, but rather within the banality of a tender moment between the two lovers. Quoting another country, they stared at each other. Suddenly, Volvato reached out and pulled Ida to him, trembling with tears, staring up behind like eyes burning and blinding, and covered her face with kisses, which seemed to freeze all as they fell. She clung to him. With a sigh, she buried her face in his chest. There was nothing erotic in it. They were like two weary children. It was she who was confronting him. Her long fingers stroked his back, and he began slowly, with a horrible strangling sound, to weep, for she was stroking his innocence out of him. The point is that Volvato and Ida's relationship challenges the color line. By its mere existence, their relationship and love offer a metaphysical space in which Volvato's beliefs about where he exists within the spectrum of race is continuously challenged by Ida with the brutal honesty that can only be made possible when one lover forces the other, and quoting Baldwin, to see himself as he is, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it, end quote. Thus, like one lover to the other, Baldwin and other activists and the other activist artists forced Bobby Kennedy to remove his mask. And just to end, although the Baldwin-Kennedy meeting was an initial failure due to Bobby Kennedy's inexperience in racial matters, it nonetheless bore fruit when on June 11th, 1963, JFK proposed legislation that would later become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. More importantly, Kennedy repeated Baldwin and the other activist sentiments that civil rights for Blacks lay at the heart of the US's moral duty to secure freedom for all. Baldwin's rhetoric thus appearing to have swayed Attorney General Bobby Kennedy and the president from what David M. Lubin characterizes as, and I quote, passivity or indifference towards a show of concern for racial equality in America. Now, lastly, I would like to just quickly bring us forward to 2021. On January 6th, 2021, pro-Trump insurgents entered Capitol Hill to impede the Democratic counting of electoral votes to validate President-elect Joe Biden's win. Amongst the thousands who attended the surrounding rallies were KKK affiliates, neo-Nazis, and other white white nationalist groups. For years, politicians such as Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and Lihan Omar, just to name a couple, have addressed the growing anxiety America's demographic shift has stirred amongst a large segment of the white population. Until now, however, no coherent strategy has been implemented to curb both extreme and moderate white nationalist groups. On June 8th, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi declared that those involved chose their whiteness over democracy. I believe that by outing whiteness as a prime motive for the violent assaults on the nation's capital, Pelosi took the first step in acknowledging publicly that race, and more specifically, the conceptualization of whiteness, has evolved beyond previously thought isolated attacks on minority groups. It has now become a matter of America's national security. And the age of Trumpism, historical negation and revisionism, and alternative facts, Baldwin's critiques on race and whiteness are all the more invaluable to understanding the political trajectory of the United States, the future of American democracy, and the moral beacon with which these two are guided. Thank you.